Family dinners always had this ritualistic dread to them, like I was voluntarily walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been written, rehearsed, and framed on the wall. My seat at the table was always 2 spaces from the end, close enough to be part of the group photo, but far enough that my words never really echoed when I spoke. My family didn't say it outright, but they all carried that same condescending smirk whenever I opened my mouth, like they were being polite just long enough for me to finish saying something irrelevant. And on this particular night, the air was thicker than usual. It started with my brother. He had just landed a middle management job at some logistics firm and was practically sweating with pride. "You know," he said, tapping his knife against his plate for attention, "I'm finally making more than enough to move out." Everyone cheered, clapped, made toasts. My dad raised his glass like he was saluting a soldier. "That's my boy," he said. "Knew you'd make something of yourself." My mom dabbed her eyes with a napkin like he'd just won a Nobel Prize, and I sat there smiling, clinking glasses, invisible in plain sight. Then came my cousin. She had just been accepted into some master's program, and before the salad was even served, they were already discussing her graduation robe color and whether the university was prestigious enough. Aunt Carol leaned in and said, "You're going to be the first doctor in the family. Can you believe it?" Someone laughed and added, "Well, unless you count fake internet businesses like some people." That comment hung in the air like a match in a gas leak. My stomach tightened. I knew who it was aimed at. They didn't even look at me when they said it. That was the worst part. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew. I tried to stay composed. I reached for the water like nothing had happened, but inside, I was boiling. Because my business, the one they always dismissed as online nonsense, wasn't just real, it was thriving. 7 figures last quarter, contracts with international brands. My name whispered in rooms they didn't even know existed, but I never talked about it at family dinner. Why? Because it wouldn't have mattered. Their perception of me was frozen in high school mediocrity, and no amount of success could thaw it. "You still doing that little website thing?" my uncle asked, stuffing mashed potatoes into his mouth. I nodded. "Yep, still at it," he snorted. "Well, good luck with that. You know, eventually, you're gonna have to get a real job. Can't coast forever." My dad chuckled. "Exactly. That internet bubble's gonna pop one day. Then what?" My mother chimed in. "Honestly, I just want you to be secure. You need something stable, like your brother or your cousin." Their words weren't just comments, they were judgments dressed as concern. My chest tightened with every advice they offered. Then it got worse. As if coordinated, my father leaned back, wine glass in hand, and said, "You know, I've worked for the same company for 26 years. You kids these days think you're smarter than stability, but I'll tell you something, status isn't something you get from TikTok or followers. It comes from showing up every day, building trust, loyalty." Another toast, another round of praise, another moment where my silence was their validation, and just as I was about to excuse myself from the table, the front door rang. My dad stood up, slightly buzzed, confused. "Expecting someone?" he asked my mom. She shook her head. "Probably a neighbor." He went to answer the door. I heard some muffled voices, then footsteps. Then a man in a sharp suit walked into the dining room, and instantly every fork and conversation froze. Because this wasn't just any man, it was his boss, the CEO of the company my dad had worked at for 26 years, and he didn't look at anyone else in the room. He looked directly at me and smiled. "Ma'am," he said, nodding respectfully. "Apologies for dropping by unannounced. I know we had an NDA in place, but I just got off a call with the board and wanted to deliver the update in person." He placed a sleek envelope on the table in front of me. "Contracts approved. Full acquisition terms. Congratulations, we're honored to be working with your team." Silence. Absolute silence. My father's face drained of all color. My cousin's fork hit her plate, and my mother looked like she had just seen a ghost. Because in that moment, everything shattered. The assumptions, the dismissals, the arrogance. I smiled politely. "Thank you," I said, barely above a whisper. "I appreciate you coming all this way." The CEO nodded, glanced at my dad, then back at me. "You've built something extraordinary. We look forward to merging your innovations with our existing platform." Then, just as quickly as he came in, he nodded and left. The front door clicked shut. and for the first time ever, every pair of eyes at the table were on me, not in mockery, but in stunned, breathless disbelief. No one said a word for a full 30 seconds. It felt like time itself had hit pause. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the silence stretch. It wasn't petty, it was purposeful. I had spent years swallowing my pride at this very table, sitting through snide remarks, passive-aggressive jokes, and veiled insults disguised as concern. And now, for the first time, their words were stuck in their throats. My dad was the first to try and break the silence. "Wait, what is this about?" His voice was dry, unsure, not angry, confused. I looked him straight in the eyes and answered in a tone that carried years of restraint turned resolve. "That website thing just sold to your company for $18 million. A fork clattered to the ground. My brother looked like someone had slapped him across the face. My cousin's mouth was slightly open, trying to compute the math. My uncle, who had just said I needed a real job, looked down at his plate like it had personally betrayed him. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. The truth did all the heavy lifting for me. They've been trying to buy into my infrastructure for over a year. I added casually. We finalized negotiations last week. He just wanted to thank me in person. Still, no one moved. My mom blinked hard. "You mean they're buying your business?" I nodded. "Yes, mine." She glanced at my father, whose face was now a cocktail of shock, pride, and bruised ego. I could tell he was trying to put the pieces together. The daughter he thought was floundering online had just signed a contract with the same Fortune 500 company he devoted 3 decades to. He had always preached loyalty to companies, but I had built one. He had worked under someone. I had become someone. My brother finally spoke, his voice shaky. "You never told us." I set my glass down gently. "Why would I? You all made it very clear what you thought of me. Every time I tried to talk about my work, you interrupted, or laughed, or looked at each other like I was delusional. Eventually, I realized I didn't owe anyone an explanation, especially not people who only listen long enough to judge." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no comeback, just the awkward weight of reflection. My cousin looked embarrassed. She had spent the past 2 years flaunting her academic path at every family gathering while side-eyeing me for being too into social media. Now, the so-called hobby she mocked had just out-earned her future salary by a factor of 100. I didn't realize," she mumbled. I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't ask." That was the truth. None of them had ever asked what I actually did. They just assumed I was chasing trends or clout. They didn't care to understand. They were too busy building a hierarchy in their heads with me at the bottom. My dad cleared his throat, desperate to reclaim control of the conversation. "Well, you should have told us sooner. We could have celebrated with you." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "No, Dad. You would have told me to be realistic, to stay grounded, to stop wasting time with things you don't understand. You didn't want to celebrate me. You wanted to fix me." That one hit him hard. His shoulders slumped slightly, and I knew, deep down, he knew I was right. The most surreal part? I wasn't even angry anymore. There was a time when I would have given anything to prove myself to them, to earn their respect. But sitting at that table, watching their stunned faces, I realized something powerful. I didn't need it anymore. Their opinions had stopped mattering the moment I started valuing my own voice. What used to feel like rejection now felt like redirection. They hadn't supported me because they didn't see my vision. That didn't make them villains, it just made them irrelevant. I stood up slowly and placed my napkin on the table. "Anyway," I said calmly, "I've got a meeting early tomorrow with the transition team. Thought I'd just swing by tonight to say hi." My mother opened her mouth, probably to protest, but I raised a hand gently. "Dinner was enlightening, thank you." And with that, I picked up my purse and coat, turned toward the door, and walked away. I didn't storm out. I didn't slam the door. I left the same way I'd always shown up, quietly, underestimated until now. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, not from stress, but release. For years, I had carried the weight of their expectations, their judgment, their need to define me. But that night, I left all of it on the dinner table, and it was the lightest I had ever felt. I got into my car and sat in silence for a few moments. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to feel every second of this clarity. For years I had walked into that house feeling like a shadow, a footnote at best. But tonight, I walked out a headline, and not because I shoved success in their faces, but because I no longer needed their validation to breathe. That feeling, that's not revenge, that's freedom. And freedom, once tasted, makes every insult, every laugh, every smug little comment they ever made feel like static behind a locked door. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls and texts from my mom. She wanted to talk. She said the family was just shocked and that they were so proud of me now. I stared at those words now, as if success had finally earned me a place at their table. As if the version of me that struggled, learned, and failed didn't deserve love until the results came with dollar signs. That was the difference between me and them. I celebrated people in their becoming. They only respected the becoming once it had a bow and a bank balance. Later that day, my dad texted too. Short and awkward. I had no idea. I'm sorry if we made you feel small. I didn't mean to. It was probably the closest to an apology I'd ever get from him, and part of me wanted to reply, not out of forgiveness, but out of habit. That old voice in my head that used to beg for their approval stirred again, but I ignored it. I didn't need to be mean. I just needed to protect the peace I had fought so hard for, so I left it on read, not out of spite, but because not every chapter needs a closing paragraph. Over the next few weeks, I got emails from executives, contract teams, even marketing leads excited to work with me. Every meeting reminded me of just how far I'd come, how I had built something real out of an idea they once mocked at a barbecue. One night, after a particularly exciting brand deal closed, I remembered my cousin bragging about finally getting a paid internship. I didn't laugh, I just smiled, because growth means you don't gloat, you outgrow, and I had outgrown all of them. One of the most satisfying parts? My dad's boss, Mr. Langston, continued reaching out. He invited me to strategy meetings, CC'd me on merger discussions, even brought me in to speak with investors. Turns out, the division they were folding me into was now outperforming legacy departments. And my father? He still clocked in at 8 a.m. and out at 6 p.m. every day, not realizing that half of the systems he used were powered by the framework I had built. That's the kind of full circle life writes better than fiction. Months passed, and I didn't attend another family dinner. They invited me, sent texts, left voicemails, but I politely declined every time, not because I held a grudge, but because I had learned a painful, liberating truth. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is stop showing up where you're only tolerated. My absence wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary. And boundaries, once set, protect you from ever needing to explain yourself again. One day, my younger cousin reached out privately. I just wanted to say sorry. I never really knew what you were doing, but it's amazing. You're amazing. I thanked her, not because I needed the praise, but because change always starts somewhere. Maybe she'd learn to treat people differently. Maybe she'd start listening before judging. Maybe my silence planted a seed that loud arguments never could. Either way, I wasn't going back. I eventually moved to a different city, not to escape, but to expand. New team, new life, new rhythm, and every once in a while, I'd get a message from a family member, checking in, asking how I was, and I'd smile, because they were no longer checking in from above, but from below. They had finally looked up and realized I was never behind. I was just building quietly while they measured success in noise. A year after that dinner, my dad retired. I sent him a polite congratulatory message. He responded with, "Proud of you, kid." It was short, simple, too late. But still, it didn't sting, because healing doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes it comes from knowing you never needed one to begin with. Sometimes it's enough to look in the mirror and see the version of you that you believed in, even when no one else did. And that right there is the best revenge. Not proving them wrong, not throwing it in their faces, just living so fully, so freely, so far beyond their imagination, that their opinions shrink into whispers you barely remember, because the only validation worth having is your own.